Mr. Fleischle illuminate all of this? I just, there's some differences of opinion.
Thank you, Chair Marcus. With your indulgence, we did leave 9 minutes on the table from the other presentation, so you give us a little flexibility on the rebuttal. I'd appreciate it very much. Okay, I will try. I can't guarantee it. You guys know a lot. But there were a couple questions that were asked, particularly by the board, that I wanted to address. One was the differences in the WIMPs and the EWIMPs and what's required. And the response, most of the response was around what's given, what kind of safe harbors are given and when they're given. But in terms of what's required, I think it's important, and particularly on your issue of if we're going to look at the four corners of the permit as opposed to the implementation side of things, look at the four corners of the permit. The WIMPs do not require, the WIMP provisions do not require multi-benefit approach or an integrated approach in order to benefit from a safe harbor. They don't require it. Now, when staff address some of your questions, they're encouraged, you know, and to your point, Board Member Moore, it makes sense to do it that way. But within the four corners of the permit, it's not required, and yet you still get the benefit of a safe harbor. So you don't have to do the water supply stuff. You don't have to have the other community types of benefits that green infrastructure provide through your WIMP process. Maybe that'll happen incidentally through the implementation phase, but it's not required in the permit. On the second point, on the implementation side, it's taken us 2.5 years to get here today from when this permit was adopted. And we've filed petitions on the WIMPs. We all acknowledge that. This permit could expire, or should expire, within 5 years. And we may not have those appeals resolved by the time a new permit is due here. And I think that's really important to keep in mind in terms of addressing those issues, especially when you're applying this to other parts of the state. Other permits have not yet adopted this language. You have information before you that the WIMP process has serious challenges, and we would say is deficient on the implementation side, and yet you're going to direct other regional boards and other permittees to comply with this language without the benefit of what you've learned from the failed Freudian slip, the failed WIMP process to date.
But help me understand this, Mr. Fleischle, which is part of it is there's the language of the permit. The other is the implementation of the permit. Right. And those are kind of two different things, because the language in the permit is pretty good.
Well, it's actually not.
You're giving us examples of where in your chart, you know, as Terry would say, important if true, you know, people aren't arguing that chart right now. But looking at it, as I said, if those followed through, as the professor stated, so then I would be concerned. And so, but it's two different things to say, here's what we're saying, we want something real, and another to say, and the way it's being implemented is okay.
Correct. I mean, I can appreciate that distinction. We have provided comments on the permit itself, and I'd like Dr. Booth to come up in a few minutes, if you don't mind, to talk about what he alluded to as, quote unquote, the limited ambition of the permit itself. And so some of the ambition of the permit I've already talked about in terms of the WIMP versus the EWIMP. And you'll note the WIMP itself in the permit, the WIMP provisions in the permit are deficient on their face because it gives a safe harbor for a process that is so ill-defined in terms of what the dischargers are providing in exchange for the safe harbor. The 2001 permit required compliance with water quality standards, and there was an iterative process. Now we're saying, and I think it was Mr. Laufer's language, there are a class of activities that warrant a safe harbor. How do the WIMPs warrant a safe harbor? There's no there, if you will, in terms of the language of what you're doing in exchange for the safe harbor, whether it's a water supply benefit, whether it's a multi-benefit approach, whether it's an integrated approach. It's not in the WIMP provisions like it is in the EWIMP provisions. So when the EWIMP provisions say 85th percentile where feasible, we say, okay, the where feasible language makes us a little anxious, but 85th percentile, you know, we can get on board with some of the comments that some of the cities are making and saying, if you did that, that would be pretty neat. You know, across the region, we could see real water supply benefits. We could see real green infrastructure improvement across those areas, and maybe that's worthy of a safe harbor. But on the WIMP side, it doesn't make any sense, and the language in the permit doesn't reflect any sort of benefit in exchange for that trade. So that's,
If the WIMP is designed to meet the receiving water limits through a reasonable assurance analysis, then I think there is some reason in that.
well, but how is that different, if you will, if I might? How is that different than the permit provisions that say achieve receiving water limits? And there was a comment earlier made, actually to staff council, about what's the difference between the iterative approach and this approach. And I did want to comment on that as well. The response from staff council was that in the iterative approach, it was a permittee-initiated process. That is simply incorrect. In the language in the iterative approach, it says that the iterative process is triggered by a determination by the permittee or the regional board that an exceedance has taken place. Unfortunately, the regional board never availed itself of the opportunity to require cities to invoke the iterative process. And so you can say it was permittee initiated, but that's not the way it was intended. And so we're having a lot of these same conversations. And then Mr. Bishop and others said that there's new authority in there now, and there are new consequences. Well, I can assure you, in the 2001 conversation, the authority is the same. This board's authority and the regional board's authority has not changed under the Clean Water Act since then. The consequences have not changed of violating the Clean Water Act, with the exception of maybe the penalties increasing over time for inflation. But the authority and the consequences have not changed from 2001. And so to that point, why is it that we would reward inaction for the last 15 years? And I know, yes, it takes time for these, but when we hear statements like that, it's been 25 years. And when we were in front of the regional board in 2006 incorporating one of the TMDLs into the permit, Chair Nahai said, you know, in 2001 we said we really mean it. And in 2006 they said we really, really mean it. You know, and now today it's like, well, we really, really, really mean it. And
I think I said that in 1990. Actually.
you may well have at Heal the Bay or somewhere similar. So those are a couple points. On the funding side, I think the funding testimony we've heard today demonstrates that the WIMP program likely will not be implemented by very many folks. The numbers that are being thrown out are very high, as you've pointed out. In 2001, we heard $200 billion to comply with the 2001 permit. How many cities spent anywhere near that to comply with the 2001 permit? No, they drug it on and on and on. I do very much appreciate Board Member Moore's comments on the financial options and the financial tools that are available to help municipalities move forward with this. But again, those tools and options are available regardless of whether a city has a safe harbor or not. So with the balance of our time, I'd like to ask Dr. Booth to come up and just talk again a little bit about the limited ambition in the permit itself, aside from just the WIMP not having the multi-benefit approach.
Thank you, and very good again to be up there. I was actually delighted to hear Board Member Moore's comments about doing a watershed plan right. I'm also a civil engineer and also a bit of a water nerd. And it is so true that a true watershed management program should accomplish those things. But to be honest, again, if you will, the limited ambition of the WIMPs, maybe the acronym is actually well chosen, do not get us there. I mean, this is 2015. The concepts of stormwater retention and of multi-benefit approaches to stormwater management. It's somewhat new to Southern California, but really this has been out for 2-3 decades around many other parts of the country. I've been involved in these kind of programs in Seattle, in Portland, in Washington, D.C. I would say this is an approach that has been embraced by your own Central Coast Regional Board, which is my hometown. If this round of the permit is to achieve the kind of really true integrated benefit that I know you are seeking, and I think we're all seeking, then a promise to try to implement a few structural BMPs over the course of the permit cycle under the watershed management program pathway to compliance simply is not going to comply. It will not achieve that. It may comply, but it will not achieve that outcome. And I think it will fall really far short of your intentions and far short of the opportunities that a permit at this stage in our understanding of how to implement these measures could actually achieve. And I do hope that within the, it says the four corners of the permit, that you strengthen the direction such that true watershed management planning can occur, which I would also mention is probably the best vehicle for accessing these other forms of funding. No one wants to fund just a stormwater treatment plant, but one that enhances water supply, that increases resilience. I mean, that's where the money is, and I think cities that are either encouraged or otherwise directed to pursue them are actually going to find a fairly happy surprise at the end of that path. Thank you very much.
Oh, just one thing. I want to acknowledge, the concern that you've voiced, and you're looking at the examples you provided. Of course, that's outside of our scope today. But it's my understanding, based on conversations I've had with regional board, that those very factors, I think, play into their technical evaluations of both the WIMPs and the e-WIMPs. I'm getting some nodding of the heads. But one thing I'd like you to comment on that I didn't really hear, and I understand, there's certain issues you want to raise that are of concern, but one of the dynamics about setting up just even a WIMP, regardless of whether green infrastructure is highlighted, is it creates an institutional, a motivation for institutions to combine and actually organize according to the watershed boundaries. So, I mean, wouldn't you acknowledge at least, comparing the iterative process approach to the WMP approach, there is a bit of a quantum step of improvement and hopefully a step that ensures a better chance of meeting standards because the institutions have to work together.
Absolutely. I did a review of nationwide watershed management programs about a year ago on behalf of the Puget Sound Partnership. And I would say the number one benefit that was cited by all of the interviewees from around the country was exactly that. It's like, wow, we actually sat down and talked with each other, and we can do that now, and we can work together. And so it is absolutely a strong step in the right direction. But I will also say that even though most of them imagined that the benefits that they would accrue is that they would build some big facility and they wouldn't have to pay for all of it, they could get different people, that actually that isn't what the benefit turned out to be. The benefit turned out to be the alignment of codes, the uniformity of development requirements, the sort of shared support of, gee, well, if I do some green infrastructure requirements, will you do it too, so that we're all moving this forward together? It was kind of the mutual support society. And there's absolutely no question that was a major benefit. And I would certainly affirm that anything in your permit that encourages entities to work together is going to be a plus. But it's going to be a plus if they are urged to work not so that we can collectively tell you how expensive it is and can't afford to do any of it, but rather we're going to work together, share development standards that move in this new direction, and now not one of us is being left behind or left out on the point, and we can share our resources and share our expertise.
On that last point, I'd like to just point out, though, in the permit, there are some individual WIMPs and there are some collaborative WIMPs. And the permit, gives flexibility on that point. So even within the four corners of the document, it doesn't say you have to be collaborative.
I want to ask Mr. Fleshley sort of a pointed question about it. So, I've read your comments a couple times. It's a lot like a legal brief and your arguments on the law as opposed to and maybe I'm just missing it. If you were going to make a change to what a WIMP needed in order to get some protection, it's a different level of protection. What changes would you recommend, or would you just drop the whole thing? I'm actually not entirely sure what you would suggest we do other than just say no. And I apologize for not being able to discern it from your comments, but I can't.
No, that's fine. Our strong preference, as you may have read, is to remove the safe harbor for the WIMPs at a minimum. We don't think they're warranted. They're not deserving of the safe harbor. If we had to change the WIMPs to make them more reflective of what we think might be worthy of a safe harbor, even though we think the safe harbors in this context are illegal for anti-backsliding, anti-degradation, and other reasons, if we had to make that false choice, that's where the 85th percentile comes in. And that's where we say, look, why can't we have a system where we say that 85th percentile capture and retention or infiltration is the ambition that we set for the Los Angeles region, and the huge water supply benefits and water quality benefits and community amenities we can get from that sort of process. That's what we're excited about, and that to me would much more mirror the type of deal, if you will, that was made in the trash TMDL, where you said, look, you deploy this kind of technology, and we can understand that you might need more time to do that, but the WIMPs are so far from that it's not worthy of that consideration at all in our mind.
Thanks. That's what you said earlier, but I wanted to understand it. Yeah, go ahead.
I'd like to hear staff's thoughts on that last comment made by Mr. Fleshley.
Yeah, and to support that, and then maybe hear also the regional board's response. That I have a question that maybe I think you thought certain places warranted more of a WIMP approach than an EWIMP approach for technical reasons. Maybe that's one explanation. So first, Board Member Dodek's question.
So it is a continuum that we're talking about here. So the way that we looked at the LA MS4 permit was that we have moved in a direction that requires accountability, a reasonable assurance analysis, a planning up front for meeting water quality standards. All of those are included in the WIMP and EWIMP, and we believe that is a good step forward, not a step backwards from the open-ended iterative process that says when you find a problem you should do something. Even if I acknowledge completely that the regional board had a role in that. I was at the regional board at the time, so I take responsibility also for that. But this doesn't put it in the context of wait until you find a problem and then propose something to correct that problem. It says try and evaluate the problem that you see and design a program on a watershed scale to address it. Now, I also acknowledge that Mr. Fleischer is totally correct that the EWIMP is more prescriptive. It is more what we want to see. Benefits, multi-benefit, enhanced watershed, infiltration, water supply, all of those things. But we believe that the WIMP also moves things forward, and that the region had a good explanation for needing to have giving the option of both of them, and so we didn't overturn that in our recommendation.
Then the distinction in if we call it safe harbor or call it, you called it something else that's in there.
We call it the alternate path to compliance.
Alternate path, but there was another one.
Compliance. Deemed compliance? Is that the word you were?
The distinction between the two, WIMPs and EWIMPs.
So I'm not sure I understand the question. I'm sorry.
What more safety does an EWIMP get than a WIMP? Or is it exactly the same?
It's not exactly the same. It's so with a WIMP you are...
I'm always thinking of the people listening who aren't in the WIMP. I'm sorry, I just think it's important.
In the watershed management program, you are deemed in compliance with receiving water limitations that do not have TMDLs with those interim and final limitations, as well as interim TMDL requirements. It's only with the EWIMP that you would be, if you are implementing within an EWIMP the 85th percentile retention standard, then you're deemed in compliance with final TMDLs during the phase of that being developed and built. So that's the additional.
Great, let's go.
Can we have the second part to that question, which Steve, remember raised with respect to asking the regional board to come up?
Just briefly, but in terms of, just explain for us, the audience, why have the WMP at all? And there must be some technical reasons that you can offer.
I'm going to just try to start off on this one and then turn it over to Renee. And it's, I think it's almost so simple that we may have overlooked it. I know it wasn't said today. And I think one time it was asked, why would a permittee select a WIMP over an EWIMP or vice versa? And really what it comes down to is geology and soils, things that are outside of control of many of the municipalities in which they reside. Where the geology and soils will allow infiltration, clearly we prefer an EWIMP, but when it does not allow infiltration, there are other stormwater management tools that have come into place and come into play over the past decade that will be relevant to meeting those. So that's the underlying basis. I want to turn it to Renee so to kind of unfold from where it goes from there.
Yeah, and just to remind, I think, Mr. Unger, you said at the beginning of today that there have been 10, was it WMPs and 12 EWIMPs that have been proposed at this point.
Correct,
Yes.
and you can almost line them up by geology and soils
Right.
as to which is which.
And that was one thing. This is Renee Purdy again. And that was something that I did want to build on what Sam was saying. I think I may have even showed a slide at the December workshop of the whole county area and the various watershed groups and pointed out that most of the watershed management groups are basically in the southeastern part of the county where there aren't the same opportunities because of the geology for the stormwater retention, whereas the enhanced programs you see in the, the valley areas, the San Fernando, the San Gabriel, even in the Santa Monica Bay watershed. And I did want to point out along those lines also that the vast majority of the land area within the county is covered by the 12 EWIMPs. The area covered by the 10 watershed management programs, and I don't have the specific statistics for you, I'm sorry, but the area, those groups tend to be smaller. They are in more densely developed areas and areas where retention is not as much of an option for those permittees. And I also wanted to mention that over half of the permittees are actually participating in enhanced watershed management programs. So while, you've certainly heard a lot of comments at the December meeting and again today and in written comments from the environmental petitioners that the WIMPs are somehow inferior, Sam and I wanted to point out that, as well as the fact that, and I think your staff and council mentioned this earlier as well, that even though some permittees are engaging in watershed management programs, not enhanced programs, they are still looking for opportunities to do stormwater retention, either through regional projects at parks or through using green streets as much as possible within subwatershed areas, or doing distributed low-impact development that's focusing on stormwater retention. And that is clearly a focus because it's a very effective way at addressing all pollutants that need to be addressed. And so there is a greatest incentive, even though the permit is not requiring it, for permittees to look for those opportunities to maximize the amount of stormwater retention, whether they're engaging in a WIMP process or an EWIMP process.
Yeah, and just to build on that, I would think a reasonable assurance analysis when you're looking at different things to plug in a given watershed area, the mathematics of it all are going to show a preference to those type of infiltration or retention type BMPs, green streets, when you start doing the math and trying to attain standards at the end of the day.
Yes, and we agree. And I just also wanted to point out, since you brought it up, as far as the reasonable assurance analysis, we really think that's one of the linchpins that distinguishes the iterative approach from the watershed management plans that we have in this permit. There's a couple of other items as well that are tethered to the WMPs, such as TMDL waste load allocations, TMDL schedules, and basically a hydrological analysis of the watershed itself. So they're quite different, really, than the iterative approach, which was really it was undefined as to what would constitute a logical next step in an iterative process.
I know you have to hear from the other board members, but let me just say that this was the major outstanding concern for me. And having heard this reaffirmation, I am very comfortable with what the staff has proposed. So let me go ahead and just for now and for discussion purposes, put out a motion to adopt the item with change sheet number 1 as proposed by staff.
Fine, but can we wait until we finish the presentation?
Sure.
And I have a lot of questions I want to ask staff too, so I'm
There's
fine.
I'm
but
sorry, there's a presentation?
They have, yeah, they have a
Oh.
rebuttal time.
We're happy to.
We've covered part of it now.
Yeah.
I thought that was it.
No.
We're happy to keep our closing remarks very brief or not at all if you guys.
It would be
want-
fine. There are things I wanted you to address and maybe other people may want you to address after hearing things today. One is I would like you to respond to the issue of costs and the model point that Mr. Tahir made in terms of folks' estimates of the cost. Again, I appreciate the comments made that folks in doing these programs don't take it all. You can measure something against the general fund, but you don't do it against the general fund, having done stormwater fees and like. I know it's not that easy, but it's not something you tend to do out of the general fund. But there's some confusion there that I'd want dealt with. And I would like you to talk about, though we're not deciding it here, actually give you a chance to respond to some of the allegations from the environmental community about how wimpy your WIMP reviews are. Just because I think that's an important backdrop to thinking about. I do think there's a difference between what's in the permit, the valid point of view that Mr. Fleischle raised about what a different WIMP might look like. But you know, it is concerning, and I want to figure out how to say that if true, this would concern me a lot. So I'd like to give you some chance to illuminate how you view what those, again, knowing that we'll be likely determining it in a future petition, as long as we're all here out in public session. That's cool, right? I'm allowed to ask that question.
So I guess before we have the opportunity for Sam to respond to the chart that you're referring to, I did want to briefly address the environmental petitioner's comments on the permit implementation process because, you know, as with the state board, the regional board wholeheartedly agrees that the success of the WIMP largely depends on the steps that are taken after permit adoption. And right now we are in the midst of significant steps as we speak. And so, as noted by Renee earlier, the regional board has devoted significant staff resources necessary to provide the careful oversight of the permit to ensure its success. With that said, we agree with what Mr. Wild said earlier that much of the environmental petitioner's comments today are not relevant to the issues that are before you today. We understand that the environmental petitioners have raised concerns with permit implementation, and I'll let Sam address that. But both the permit and the water code provide a separate process whereby those concerns might be addressed.
I don't mean to interrupt you. I know that.
Okay.
I just want to know. I want to give you a chance
Thank you
to
for that
respond because those
introduction.
allegations are
Yes.
kind of damning. So I wouldn't want to leave some interim response unsaid, and I'm concerned about them. And I think we need to be clear on our expectations, even though we get another bite at the apple when it comes to us, that we would expect more than is alleged here, I would assume. That's all.
Thank you for the opportunity to remark on that. And again, I think my remarks are very simple. I'll try to start there and then go into a little bit deeper, if you will. But quite simply, the charts that have been delivered to you and you're looking at today are, they're not complete. They don't represent the completed process of the review of the WIMPs. So essentially what you see is you see some of the comments that board staff made on some of these WIMPs, and we just received the responses on Friday. In the office yesterday, we made it a high priority for staff to start looking at these, and they started looking at a couple of them, and it looks like as if very preliminary now at this point, but that most if not all of the comments that we provided in the conditional approvals that we sent out on the WIMPs were addressed. So I would say, basically, I think what you're looking at in the chart is sort of a work in progress. It's a little bit outdated by maybe as of last Friday, perhaps. And I think it demonstrates our process that we're working, with the permittees, the stakeholders, the watershed management groups, to essentially approve a WIMP that that will achieve the water quality standards and the progress as we move forward. So with that, I can answer specific questions.
The model.
Excuse me?
Talk about the model.
The model, yeah. I'm sorry. Again, we have not seen any cost estimates that we find that we can tie to anything yet in terms of documented costs or studies and things like that we have any reliability with. When we looked at the last annual report, which was from the previous permit, if you will, the costs were essentially all over the map. There was no logic by which they were and consistency by which each municipality developed their costs. And so we had a pretty wide range of costs when we tried to normalize it to either area or to a number of citizens in each municipality. We are working now with the new permit to have a more uniform basis of cost. Gerald Horner, who is on staff here, is no longer here, unfortunately, who's advising us. We're looking elsewhere to get some advice on how to use some uniform cost types of numbers so we can get a better idea on the cost. But I'll also remark, though, just last week, someone that we know is also a water nerd in the city of Los Angeles, Adel Haj Khalil. He testified to his subcommittee of City Council, Energy and Environment, that the costs are on the order of $4.50 per residential parcel in the city of Los Angeles. He also pointed out one other thing, which I found interesting too, which I didn't know until that time, but in the city of Los Angeles, there has been a parcel tax for stormwater that was adopted back in 1992, so more than 25 years. What's that? Yeah, well, very good. But that's the good part, and the part that's not quite as good is that it hasn't been adjusted since that time. So it's I mean, I think to say that these costs are outlandish and they can't be dealt with and things like that, I think is it's going to have to play itself out. There may be new funding models. Maybe a parcel tax is the way to go. There may be some cities that are right for it now that could accept such a thing. Maybe others can't. But there's also some Prop 1 monies, as you may know, that we think that many of the cities have told us that they're going to compete for, which we can get this, get some of these projects started and initiated.
Are there any other? I'm sorry, we usurped your total time. So anything else that you wanted to add? And then I have just a set of questions for staff, but I'd also open it to my colleagues to opine, because I know you all have been following this and I'm interested in what you all think.
And I was going to conclude my portion very quickly that the regional board intends to consider the regional board's petition for regional board review in September. Yes.
And Chair Marcus, I just had a few minutes of concluding remarks, if that's okay. So in conclusion, we'd like to reiterate what we believe to be the combination of strength, practicality, and innovation built into this MS4 permit. It's a marriage between a number of very stringent permit advancements, including the inclusion of requirements of 33 TMDLs and reasonable assurance requirements that you've heard about, with a process that facilitates collaboration, shared technical and financial resources, and multi-benefit and multiple TMDL addressing solutions that you heard from Board Member Moore. And last but not least, where possible, permittees will be implementing retention-based solutions that will augment local water supplies and can also be used strategically, which is one thing we haven't talked about today, to improve groundwater quality, example, where we're offsetting salts in some of our water. So there's another great advantage of these stormwater approaches. And again, we thank you for your careful consideration of our comments and those of others today. Thanks.
Thank you. And if you don't mind, why don't we just list whatever issues we want staff to respond to and then we can talk about it. And I'd be interested in your thinking on some of it. A couple of issues came up, different ones than I thought actually would come up. And I think you've answered the WMP, EWMP issue. Again, on all of these, I think reasonable minds can differ. I do think that we're at a phase where we're actually trying to figure out what's the best way to move forward, mindful of the past and past statements of intention that haven't come to fruition. And I think what we're hearing, understandably, maybe from myself as well, is an impatience with how long it's taken to deal with these. Certainly from when I think back to the early 90s when we thought BMPs were actually going to yield more than they ever yielded, it's been a long road. At the same time, I do want to acknowledge that this permit, and this permit as the draft order amends, is a significant leap forward and different from business as usual, to be sure, and that it is a big lift. So again, any of those issues that folks want to talk through would really be important. I do think there were a number of issues raised where folks disagreed with the language that you had put in the revised order, and sometimes in response the language that Ms. Purdy put up on the slides, and I would love you to go through the suggestions from the regional board as well as maybe some of the things you heard, the non-stormwater issue being part of it, where it felt like people's views on what that language meant was all over the lot. And I could see it any number of ways, and most of the time I would just say that the way you wrote it seemed, again, you could wordsmith everything. I think, again, that we're dealing with this in the context of I think there has to be a certain amount of faith and trust, but we also need verification, to quote a former governor who then moved on, trust but verify. And so I would like you to talk a bit about that process, which seemed to me to be, at least in intent, and then as how you edited it, to be important, which was the reasonable assurance analysis is really important. The every 2-year adaptive management is really important, but people throw those words out and then don't actually do. And so then you put in the report back to us at a shorter interval. So I know we're trying to build in belts and suspenders and things to make sure that this time we really do move forward. But I know I'm going into yet another issue, but I would like your comments on the specific language you heard people have different views on, and whether there are any of them that you would suggest adopting.
So I'll start with the non-stormwater discharge suggestion from the regional board. Is that the one you want to hold? That one.
The only thing I'm interested in is your views on adopting what Renee Purdy presented from the regional board, which I thought I heard you said it's okay. And if I didn't hear that, then
right, on the
elucidate,
yes.
Please.
So on that particular issue, the non-stormwater discharge prohibition, the effective prohibition, we are actually quite comfortable with adding the language that the regional board has. We'll probably have, I think there's a reference I want to add and a couple of tweaks, but we'll put that up for you when we're ready to have any additional changes. So in addition to change sheet 1, we would have a couple of recommendations based on what we heard from them. So on that issue, I think we're okay. Based on what I heard, permittees also say that they were comfortable with it, generally. And the next issue, I think, that you brought up is the reasonable assurance analysis when it's done, when the different updates are done. Did I understand that correctly?
Created an architecture. It's not really belt suspenders, flying monkeys, but it's trying to come up with something that can give us some assurance that we're not just punting down the road for another 6 years and then we find out everybody changes. We can stipulate that these guys care about it, but maybe they're not here anymore, and that we end up in that same drawn out saga.
So I'll jump in on this because I think this is more the policy side than the legal side, which is the lens that we looked at the permit was that they had a concept and they had a set of requirements in the development of a reasonable potential, a 2-year iterative process to read this, that that provided a framework, but there wasn't a feedback loop that we could recognize and be a part of. And so we added what we thought were issues for accountability and transparency into the scheme. There are always different ways that we could have done that, and there are always more or less that we could add. But what we tried to do was say that you need to be monitoring and using that monitoring data to reflect back on your adaptive management. We want you to report back to us on your progress of not only what you put in, but how effective those are. And finally, we want you to put a concerted effort into reevaluating all the assumptions that you made a year ago or so when you put together the reasonable potential analysis or your 85th percentile retention plan for EWIMP, and reevaluate that with the information that you gather over these 2-year reporting programs. That's why we think it's different than we think it's a good approach, and we'll just figure out in 10 years if it worked or not. We're trying to build into it a feedback loop that not only the permittee can look at, but the regional board, the public, and you and your staff on a regular basis to feed back into it. Yes, is there trust in this? Of course there is, because we're saying that what you need to do is look at your individual problem, make plans, and then verify those plans, or then evaluate those plans through a modeling exercise, and then verify that those assumptions work. So that obviously means that we don't know what the right answer is for every individual city today, but we've built a process, we hope, that would provide that feedback.
Can I jump in on this? I'm very comfortable with that approach, and it is a significant change. So the only question that I would have is, in light of the fact that these are, individual permits, what could be done on a more policy focus with respect to our board continuing to watch this closly as individual reports? I misspoke when I said an individual permit. I'm talking about the reports that come in would be individual reports, right, as opposed to a report that we could look at as a board. So could this come back before us with?
We've built that in so that it will come back to you as an integrated report. I can't remember the timing on that.
January 2020,
Is the big
2021?
update, but then following that, there's a kind of an integrated report trying to integrate all the data from the last.
But I think buried in what you said is that these are individual MS4 phase 1. This is one. There will be one that we talked about for the San Francisco Bay Area, for all of the Central Valley. And every time that we've adopted an MS4, things have changed a little bit over time. So what we are trying to do now is put together some big picture thoughts about stormwater and the issues that are raised by stormwater, one of which is this issue related to what is the right reasonable potential? What is the right way to do this, looking outside of the individual permit petition issues here? And so that's part of what we'll be bringing forward to you later in the summer and fall, is under the strategic initiative, looking at a bunch of pieces of the bigger stormwater issue that are outside of permit by permit review.
What about, one of the things I'd like to see, I do appreciate this architecture that we've done a lot. Again, we don't get to talk together except when we're out here, but I appreciate the time you've given to put more bells and whistles into this to address my concern, or taken certain bells and whistles out to address my concerns that I assume other people must have agreed with or not object to, because I can't talk to them outside of this. But I'm still a little uncomfortable given, again, this is a very important permit. You're absolutely right. This one is not going to resolve every issue for all time. And we are spending a lot of time on this, not just in those individual permits, but in the stormwater strategy or whatever we're calling it now, which I'm impressed with. But I think there's a lot of trust but verify in this, and I think there's the perfect can be the enemy of the good in terms of trying to figure it all out like clockwork. On the other hand, there can be folly in not staying on it and then moving on to the next thing. So I'd be open to any suggestion that you may have as you go through any additional changes that my colleagues may ask for or you've come up with in terms of check-ins. And it's not just putting it in the executive director's report. It would have to be, let's come back, either fast-track permit appeals from that or have an update within a year on how this is going, because I really do think we have to stay on it. If we go with this, it requires and behooves us to put ourselves where our mouths are as opposed to just moving on to the next thing. And it's hard to think of a permit that's more important.
So I would like to make a suggestion on that. It seems
Hiding a suggestion, good.
It seems to me that the next big milestone is September board meeting by the regional board, where they're going to consider the WIMPs. My suggestion would be that that we, the state board staff, report back to you on the results of that meeting. Looking, but more than just the results, but looking at the WIMPs and the comments and the concerns and the response by the regional board, so that you have your staff's opinion on how things went at the first major milestone. There will be another one for the EWIMPs, and I don't know that off the top of my head, but what I would commit is that staff will attend those two hearings and that we'll review the documents and come back to you at a meeting about probably the following month. I don't want to say the next board meeting because I don't know what the timing is exactly. With a report back so that you understand, and then you have a workshop or an item on it so that you can hear from the regional board and from the environmental petitioners and from the permittees on that process and where it came out. Because I think you're right, that is the first chance that we'll have to report back on how the implementation is going.
And certainly while you digest what Mr. Bishop put out, just the one additional layer I'd put on that is he did make a reference there that he expects that there will be petitions filed. What I would recommend is that we just, if the board is interested in injecting this, first I think it can be done by a motion as opposed to an additional ordering provision of the draft order. But that the timing of it be we wait and see whether there are petitions filed and schedule an item, duly noticed as part of our board agenda after that the time for filing petitions has run.
How long is
and
that?
when the issues, they have to file within 30 days of actions by the regional board. And at that point in time, we'll have the universe of issues that are potentially raised. You heard the representation. I'm going to reiterate the point again. The WIMPs and the characterizations you've heard of the adequacies and deficiencies of those WIMPs are not before you today. Shouldn't be a basis for any decision you all make today. But it's possible that there's been significant changes made, and perhaps some of the biggest concerns raised by the environmental non-governmental organizations may be addressed, and we'll have a more focused conversation. But also, you all are aware that we revised the petition regulations within the last year, and there's a much more expedited process by which petitions would be dismissed unless there's some action for the board. And this meeting that would be set after petitions are filed, I wouldn't say the first board meeting afterwards, but after your staff have had a chance to at least take a peek at those petitions, synthesize the issues, could provide a framework for determining during the 90-day period that the board has to determine whether or not it's going to actually initiate review of a petition.
Avoid Mr. Fleshley's 2.5-year nightmare scenario.
So that would, provide you all an opportunity to feedback early into that petition process. So just kind of summarize what I would anticipate is that in any motion, if the board is interested in this, you can indicate that after the regional board acts on the WIMPs, which could be as early as September, is what we heard from Ms. Fordyce, your staff would schedule a board item following the receipt of any petitions challenging those approvals, and we would do that shortly thereafter, after the board staff has had an opportunity to review those petitions. So it would not be an abstract conversation. You would actually potentially have a true conflict and a suite of issues that could be noticed. People could come in, share views, and you could make an informed preliminary determination about what process we'll have going forward.
I just wanted to add that, so the 2021 date for the update, and I mentioned that the report after that, which is 2022, we also have 2 earlier reports to the State Board.
I saw that. Thank you. That's what I wanted you to
We weren't proposing to make those any earlier because they're timed so that they come after the first adaptive management process and then following the second adaptive management process. But if you wanted those dates to be earlier, we could also work with those dates. Right now,
those are more formal reviews. This may take care of sort of the first issue, but I probably would like some sort of a yearly quick status report to check in the public, because then we also have the ability for folks, I mean, I know it takes a lot of time, but for folks to weigh in on how it's going, because it is really important. I mean, this could be historic, path-breaking, and quite wonderful. And important in leveraging what it is we hope to see, but we need to know whether it is or it isn't, or all along the way. I just think it's, from the State Board perspective, I do think it's important. I like what you already put in, but I would like a status update, at least in the first year.
I'd like to jump in on that. I agree, and also to include information on financial assistance, because by then those bond dollars should be starting to roll out.
Yeah, and there are legislative concepts under development too that will deal with financing.
I don't disagree, but I do think that over the next 2 years, we're going to have an MS4 coming out of San Francisco, out of the Bay Area. We're going to have an MS4 coming out of Region 8. We are going to have some changes, possibly, I think some are already in the works, in Region 9. And we just heard that there is one in Region 5. So I would hesitate to say let's focus exclusively on Region 4 for our annual visit of the MS4s. I think we will have a range of opportunity, and perhaps having the discussion of MS4s and probably the strategic initiative on stormwater. I personally would like to say that, be general, yes, let's look at stormwater as it's being implemented statewide annually, but I would hesitate to tie it just to Region 4's process, because we will have several processes, plus we will have the initiative. And so I
think that's a fair point. I just want to make sure Region 4 is in that yearly one.
Absolutely.
So that can work for me. You're right. There may be other things we want to hear about, but I just want to make sure that we're sending a clear signal to the affected participants that we're not just... No, and we're not just going to be done, because that's the thing about it. I mean, we deal with it in the Delta Stewardship Council as well. If you're doing adaptive management, that means more time for all of the regulators and the people engaged, because the only way it works is if you actually have a spotlight on actually doing the adaptive management. So doing adaptive management takes far more work on everybody's part than the normal regulatory back and forth work, top-down model, but it actually does take more time on everybody's part, but you get a better result. In theory, right? So you can figure out how to word that.
So I have no problem with that, of course. I think that we can work it in with what Michael suggested and add something to about annually thereafter, so that we set it up to address the first issue with the WIMP review. I would and then continue that on an annual basis.
I have to echo what Fran's saying, though. I understand, we're hearing strong input from environmental petitioners here in the Los Angeles region on this action. But this annual check-in, if we're going to propose something like this, for me, it needs to read alternative path to compliance.
It would be more than just
more generic.
the
It's
Los
not-
Angeles. I'm sorry, I didn't clarify that. I would say that this would be a annual focus on stormwater compliance issues related to the MS4s. And I can't give you the exact title of it today, but
Yeah, and my sense is that this is central to the Stormwater Strategic Initiative. This is one of the pillars in terms of this infrastructure, focus and long-term commitment of California cities and urban areas, not just the Los Angeles region, to looking at multi-benefit work. Chair, you've touched on most of the lingering questions that I've had. I think the environmental petitioners bring up a very important point early on about the controversial aspect of accepting some risk at the regional board, state board level about when the intent is declared to develop the WIMP and the EWIMP, then you're in compliance. And then there's this period, are we getting good plans? And is the accountability and the responsiveness warrant the compliance that's granted or deemed? And so I heard, I was made to feel a little bit better by the regional board's response to the description of the process for the WIMP review. It is, so I just want to echo, I think I'm in the same boat as Chair Marcus, that this is a risk we're willing to accept to a point. But if we hear from our permittees that they don't really believe this is meaningful and that they don't buy into green infrastructure and they think it's too expensive, so the heck with it, and they're just going to take advantage of this risk we've accepted, that's a big problem. And so I had the same strong reaction because I was concerned that this was being taken advantage of. But and really, as we write it in this order, we're not very specific about what those points checking in are. What are those accountability points for the planning process? Now, I think this September check-in, the appeal to the regional board, the public meeting, a lot of those issues are going to be vetted and give us some experience in terms of this risk that we've accepted to allow compliance during the planning phase. I don't know how much more we need to tighten it other than to have this public accountability through, the public meeting. Right. And so, just it heightens the importance of the participation of our environmental community, but other interested parties, to make sure that this good faith gesture on the parts of the water boards is met in good faith by our regulated community. I think in most cases it is, because folks are realizing pretty quickly that by working together and they're seeing all these multi-benefits and all these economic advantages, and lo and behold, stormwater is a source of wealth for our community, not a risk or a source of liability. So I have much faith in that, but I just want to, give voice to those concerns. This is kind of a new thing. So, and I don't know, it could be an area we could tighten up more in this order, but I also want to give some deference to the update that the water board, the regional board just gave us, that they believe in the most part the concerns are being addressed and that the process is not being taken advantage of. Okay, and are we, as we give the guidance to the other regional boards or our own state board staff in the statewide permits, do we need to specify a time period for this? Is the time period specified in the permit?
In terms of when the permits should be reopened?
Or no, the planning phase for a
For the
WIMP or
planning
an
phase, no,
EWIMP?
we actually don't say anything about the planning phase and the principles that we articulated for the regional board.
And does the regional board's order speak to the length of time? It just has a due date on the submittal of the initial plan.
They do. but, we didn't say anything specific about that time period. We do talk about significantly about the constraints that are imposed by the regional board on the permittees during that period, and look to whether there's actual progress and implementation even during the planning phase.
I think that's the only area in this whole order that I thought, wasn't sure we were specific enough or could be stronger, but I don't have any set recommendations there. But is there any other comment?
So we did not address that because we didn't think it was that setting a time statewide for precedent for all alternative compliance plans made sense. There are people in different stages of looking at this, and setting up a certain time frame didn't seem appropriate to us. We looked at the time frame that was in the LA permit and just didn't feel that we needed to make any changes on that, and considered the thought about precedentially for when all the other regions we're asking them to look at alternate compliance and include alternate compliance paths in their permits. They don't have to look exactly like the LA one, and we did not choose to impose any specific time frame on that.
But maybe we could read within the existing language here that we expect some time frame, some finite.
Yes,
Yeah.
definitely.
I think it might be there already. I just think it's an important point that I want to acknowledge from the environmental perspective.